Welcome to Dr. Joe Unplugged. The topics discussed in this podcast will reflect my opinions and are not in any way to be regarded as medical advice. It's always fascinating to me when the obvious tends to get dismissed by the powers that be because there apparently isn't evidence to support the obvious. And so every so often, research is done that actually demonstrates the obvious. Sugary drinks may raise the risk of type 2 diabetes, study finds. When it comes to managing the risk of developing type 2 diabetes, there is no safe level of sugar-sweetened beverage consumption, according to a new study. At the same time, the study finds that moderate consumption of sugars contained in solid foods or eaten with them may actually lower the risk of developing diabetes. Yeah, look, maybe, maybe not. The study supports a beneficial role of sugar in a balanced, healthy diet as long as it does not include sweetened liquids such as soft drinks or fruit drinks. You cannot totally avoid sugars, and arguably neither do we need to. Even the ketogenic diet, which does have less than 50 grams of carbohydrate per day, still has something up to 50 grams of carbohydrate per day. Now, sugar and carbohydrate are not synonymous. Now, jargon is a problem here, and I think it is important to just untangle it a little bit. We think about sugar as a bit of a global term for anything that's sweet. Now, there's also fructose, and sugar itself is a combination of two molecules, one of glucose and one of fructose. In the human bloodstream, carbs will get broken down typically into glucose. That's the one that floats around the bloodstream, and that's the one that it gets too high. If your glucose is too high for too long, that's when there's diabetes. Now, and that's type 2 diabetes. Type 1 diabetes is where the body doesn't produce enough insulin from the pancreas, and insulin is the body's hormone that gets glucose out of the bloodstream and into the cells. Now, often people say, I've got high blood sugar. What they're talking about really is high blood glucose. And technically, from a chemical point of view, sugar is not the same as glucose. Sugar is those two molecules, one fructose, one glucose. Glucose is glucose, fructose is fructose, and in the USA, there is an issue with high fructose corn syrup, which is obviously syrup made from corn and has got a lot of fructose in it. But fruits do have a sugar content. A lot of foods do have a content of sugar and or various carbohydrates. And when you look at labels, there'll often be total carbohydrates and then total sugars. And then it gets a bit more complicated because some that will claim to be low in sugars may have maltose or polydextrose or a whole lot of other non-sugar, sugar defined as glucose and fructose, non-sugar sweet carbohydrates that will get broken down by the body and eventually become glucose, because that is what floats around in the human bloodstream. So jargon is a problem. It's also, I suppose, helpful, if you like, to people who want to bamboozle you. And in this instance, I probably will point the finger a little bit at some of the food manufacturers. And labels on food packets are typically quite small. You need a magnifying glass, and that is, look, I get it. They're complying with regulations, and I'm sure if it was in much bigger font, it'd probably take up the whole pack. Tells you something in itself. Although a sweet tooth is often associated with increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, a new meta-study shows that the link between sugar and the condition is more nuanced than one might think. And that actually does make some sense. If you go back to the 1970s, there was not very many people with type 2 diabetes. And I really want to emphasize again the difference. Type 1 diabetes is not diet-related. Your body doesn't produce enough insulin, often a genetic condition, and that is treated with insulin. But type 2 diabetes, and there are some writers and authors who argue that it's a misnomer because by definition it isn't a lack of insulin. It actually comes from insulin resistance. So you've eaten too many foods over too many years that have converted into glucose in the bloodstream. The body has produced insulin. So the glucose levels goes up, the insulin levels go up, glucose levels go down. I got to watch the jargon too, hey? Glucose levels go down, insulin level goes down, and the body's whipping around. And this is why when people go on low-fat diets, they struggle to lose weight, because insulin stores glucose in the body as fat. So people really do get frustrated. They go to the gym and their body is in fat storage mode and they're not burning up fat, which of course they won't. Nobody will do when they're in fat storage mode. So historically, when people ate some sugar, and that is included in, for example, all fruits virtually, and yes, nuts and vegetables will have some sugar, eggs, and like most foods, there will be some amount of glucose in them. Some of it's quite negligible, and some it's a little bit more. When it's in a solid food, the body has to break it down so it doesn't get released into the bloodstream quite as quickly. If you eat a steak, it takes a while for the body to digest that. It doesn't take nearly as long to digest any form of liquid. And that doesn't matter whether that liquid is water or soft drink or fruit juice. So when one has a liquid that contains higher amounts of, again, any sort of sugar, including glucose, fructose, and the others, it gets absorbed into the bloodstream quite quickly. Now, the body likes to keep all parameters within a certain reference range, and that includes your blood pressure, your pulse, your temperature. And yes, if you exercise, your pulse and blood pressure go up, but then when you stop and you're resting, it comes back down to normal. And the body seeks to maintain glucose levels within a certain range, seeks to maintain sodium, potassium, the list goes on, within certain ranges. And we know the consequences when a lot of these parameters get out of range. That's when we can get illness. But it gets absorbed more quickly when it's in a liquid form. And if it gets absorbed more quickly, then the level in the bloodstream spikes and the body responds to that. If it gets drip-fed in and the levels of glucose in the bloodstream don't go up as quickly, then the body doesn't need to produce as much insulin. And if it produces less insulin, then over days and weeks and months and years, it's less likely that it leads to insulin resistance, which when the body cells say, look, we've had enough of being pounded by all this insulin to get rid of the glucose. And then the next step after that is type 2 diabetes. So it is absolutely no surprise at all, and shouldn't be to anybody, that yes, more consumption of liquids with lots of glucose and sugar and fructose in it, the more of that you consume, the more likely you're going to go on to develop type 2 diabetes. And it also shouldn't come as a surprise that if we eat the sort of diet that people ate up until around the early 1980s, that we're not going to get as many cases of type 2 diabetes. And no, having some foods that have some glucose or sugars or fructose or others in them of itself, particularly in solid foods where they get eaten, and broken down more slowly, and the glucose gets released into the bloodstream more slowly, that's not a big deal. Now, is it impossible to get type 2 diabetes even if you do all the right things? Look, it's not impossible, it's pretty rare, and it was pretty rare for centuries. Until the 80s and 90s, when we had the introduction of the low-fat dietary guidelines and everybody started eating foods that have got a lot more carbohydrates. And in particular, refined carbohydrates. And we've touched on a few, but refined carbohydrates is very different to that with the carbohydrates which are found in foods which variably grow in the ground or have been running around or moving somewhere. It's not that difficult. I'm not sure that we needed meta-analyses to tell us that we should be drinking water, which is essentially what this is saying. And fruit juice has had its saintly aura because it's fruit. And yes, having some fruit most days is quite good. I'm not sure everybody needs to eat 2 serves of fruit per day. Not sure that that's absolutely necessary. But a glass of apple juice requires about 4.5 apples to make it. orange juice, the numbers for the comparable. Pretty unlikely you're going to eat 4 or 5 apples, and if you did, you wouldn't eat for a while. But if you had a glass of apple juice, you're still going to be hungry. And you've had the concentrated, assorted sugars from 4 or 5 apples. And it gets absorbed very quickly. This should not come as a surprise. It is fairly obvious, but it's been hidden, and the powers that be don't like to talk about it because it goes against the narrative. So it's not difficult. Being healthy is not difficult. And in this instance, really what this research is now telling us, aside from the fact that water is wet, telling us really that we should mainly drink water, and if we're eating sensibly, then our likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes is significantly reduced. And no, this doesn't need government action. It doesn't need bans on advertising. It doesn't need sugar taxes. It just needs for you as an individual to make decisions about what you put into your mouth, and in particular, which liquids you choose to drink. And the best liquid to drink day to day is water, which, by the way, is wet. Thanks for listening to Dr. Joe Unplugged. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like, share, and consider subscribing. Tell your friends. If there are topics you'd like to see covered, be in touch through the chat or email info@drjoe.net.au. We'll be uploading new content each Monday, and soon we'll be putting these videos out on X. You can follow me there at Dr. Joe's DIY Hell.